So I guess everybody knows this cartoon in some way. It's back from the early 90s in some way, from yesterday. I'm interested in the 90s. But what I find interesting about this special kind of cartoon is something else, that if we can talk about the internet in some way, we can also think about internet years in some way like dog years. And that means then all of a sudden as a researcher, for me, so part-time I'm researcher, part-time activist in some way, that it's more interesting to think about something that's then not 20 years old, but 140 years, because then you come into histories and into this kind of like, the big advantage historians always have is this historical sense, which always is about the drama of change. So if you see a bigger period, and we had this yesterday on the table in discussion, you see all of a sudden how a drama of change can really happen, and you just don't have, like social scientists sometimes have this kind of problem to only pick up different kind of moments, and it's not so, let's say, dramatic. But here what I'm interested in is not the typically kind of historiography. It's more like something that's genealogy, which comes of course from Nietzsche, and Foucault took this up in quite a way. So the idea of a genealogy is that you actually trace back some of the traces and possible path. So you not like have this kind of eagle perspective, looking down and explaining everything, but you're really trying to dig more like a mole. You try to dig into something. And here I'm especially interested in the 90s and the internet times, and my different kind of perspective, or specific kind of perspective here is the 90s and especially the European field in that way. And I guess it's very important to say that it's not a claim to explain anything else than this kind of specific field, but I'm interested to actually try out this different kind of concepts that I will show to you with you in the next 3 days as well. The next. So what I'm especially interested in, we wrote a book about this. It's called Forgotten Futures. It's in German. And we were interested about these radical net cultures of the 90s, especially in Europe, because you could see that in some way there's a distinction between the US counterpart in some way. And we heard yesterday a little bit about this from counterculture to cyberculture, and Manuel Castells, and people wrote a lot about this US approach. But what I think is, instead of this kind of Californian ideology as it was labeled in the 90s, and this kind of very much, okay, we go now to the cyberspace and the last frontier and tried to settle there, the European perspective was more like it was squads in Amsterdam, for example. It were in Berlin. A lot of very political activists who actually just took this more or less shitty computers and tried to connect them. So their interest was more in this kind of social practices than actually the technology itself. And I think that's what I'm mostly interested in, this kind of fields. And I'm also interested in the next, what happened or grew out of that. It's called something like tactical media, but I guess that's also a very European approach in that way. I guess Juan has another approach to that. It was a movement which especially like spread out after the fall of the Berlin Wall in Europe, and it was in the beginning more or less centered around video. But it's also interesting that these tactical media are not only limited to digital technologies and digital media, and I think that's very important in some way, that we look at old and new media formats, so by any media necessary, but as well as Nishan's thought piece explain in some way, that we also look at technologies of the self, technologies of the market, technologies of the state, and that we don't concentrate too much about this kind of ideology of the newness and digital media only. And this brings me to something about post-mediality. Like Oliver and I, we are doing this project in Lüneburg, which is called Post-Media Lab. And of course, this goes also back to Italy, to the 70s. I'm Felix Gattari, who coined the term of post-mediality. And I would say it's a non-deterministic theory of media, which means that it's neither this kind of typically manipulation theory, so mass media is just manipulating us, but also not this naive standpoint, as you said, Remco, of this kind of, okay, emancipatory standpoint, just bring in the new technology and democracy is following in some way. And what's interesting today is this kind of paradox that on the one side we have a completely decentralization of the means of production, so digital technologies, everybody has his and her iPad, phones and so on, but on the other side you have a completely centralization if it comes to the relations of the ownership. So the whole infrastructure is actually owned or is in the hands of quite a few companies. And I think an idea we should also talk about in the next days is to talk about infrastructure again and how to build up infrastructure. And I guess that's an approach I would like to take on.